Hello, welcome to Political Prude, the podcast. Now, as some of you may know, this podcast started out as an Instagram live stream show way back after GE 2020. It has been an incredibly wild ride since, and the Political Prude series has seen politicians from both the ruling party and also the opposition come in, and also expert guests who help us learn about different topics and current affairs. So some time has passed, and since then I started a new company with some of my friends, and it's called Zerat Media. As some of you know, I really love podcasts. And I love the process of researching, learning, and putting together long-form conversations. So then it became a very natural direction for us to then start a new arm under this business, calling it Zora Pop by Zerat Media, which really is a podcast network. So the reason I'm able to be here today, speaking with you guys on this podcast, is because of supportive partners like ErgoTune, Everdesk Plus, and also Audio Technica. And of course, my team at Zora Pop. Now, the team has been working incredibly hard over the last couple of months putting this show together. It's called Political Prude, the podcast. How we are launching this show is that we're putting together a series of episodes dedicated to the 2023 presidential elections. Now, what I hope to achieve with this show is that young voters like you and me can come in here, listen to the episodes on 1.5 times speed, 2 times speed, and walk away feeling a lot more confident about what we are voting for and who we are voting for. In this show, we're going to be having expert guests come in to teach us about the elections and also some of the presidential hopefuls themselves. Now, for the first episode, we have Dr. Gillian Koh. She's the Senior Research Fellow and Head of Politics and Governance Cluster at the Institute of Policy Studies. Now, if her name sounds familiar to you, it's probably because you saw her on TV sharing her political insights on the news or even just reading her name on the newspapers. Now, she'll be coming in to help us understand the role of the president and also to understand what we're even voting for. Before we dive into the episode, I have a favor to ask. Show some love by giving us a thumbs up and also by clicking that subscribe button on YouTube. Please also share this episode on platforms like WhatsApp and Telegram with your family and friends. It will really help us. And now, let's dive into this conversation. Hi, Dr. Gillian.
Hi.
I'm so happy that you're here. I'm actually so excited for everybody to be learning from you today because I feel like you are probably the one person that knows the most about what we're going to be entering, you know?
Well, I wouldn't say that. It's just that it's an occupational hazard and I happen to be asked to be commenting on it often enough.
So when I was talking to my friends about the presidential elections, what I realized was that a lot of my friends don't know what they're voting for, actually. And these are people who have been through school, university, they read the news, but they simply don't understand what they're voting for. And I think that's a bit worrying.
Sure, I wouldn't blame them because, we've only had 2 elections,
True.
For the presidency since it was instituted in 1991. So the first election was in 1993, and then the second election was in 2011. So I wouldn't blame them, especially if we have young voters, people who just turned 21. And then there's a whole bunch who have turned 21 since 2011. And then there are new citizens as well. So it's quite important to understand the role of the president as they go to the ballot box to decide who would be the best candidate to be the president of Singapore.
Fun fact is that this is actually my first time voting in a presidential election, so I'm actually really excited. That's of course assuming that there will be a contest, right? So, I'm praying that there will be one because I think it'll be so much fun to go to the polls.
It's consequential. We understand the president is the head of state, and the president is supposed to be someone who stands above the political fray because he or she necessarily has to be somebody who unifies the country, as we saw during the COVID pandemic, right? That we feel that this is somebody who represents Singapore, who can mobilize and inspire Singaporeans to do things that are for Singapore's best interest. And in a pandemic, of course, we needed people to have the courage to carry on. The nursing staff have to know that they are valued. The essential workers have to know that their contribution to keeping Singapore safe is critical. So I think, the president has that role to play. Let's break it down to 3 things that the president does, if you can. First, there is the ceremonial and representative role. So that's quite important. We understand, right, the head of state represents us certainly with the interactions with foreign friends, correct? So that's the ceremonial role. The second is the community role. So you see the president, you think of the president, and then immediately the idea of the president's challenge comes to mind. So very often you see the president of Singapore championing various charitable causes, recognizing the needs of disabled people. The first elected president in 1993 was Ong Teng Cheong, and he was a great advocate for the arts. So people think of that, and certainly late S.R. Nathan, very, very much associated with charitable causes. And then you had Tony Tan, who said that he wanted to champion social enterprise. And when you come to the current president, Madam Halima, you associate her with, of course, the needs of the disabled, people with mental health issues, but more critically, causes to do with social cohesion in Singapore, right? Interreligious and interracial harmony. And she did 2 major international conferences around that. So that's the community role. The final one, and the most critical one for which we need to go to the elections for, and that's the custodial role. And there are 5 key powers around that. The first one has to do with our national reserves. The president has the right to veto the government's plans to tap the nation's past reserves. And so the president has to look at the ongoing budgets and identify when there's a need to either draw down on or actually will impinge on the use of the reserves, and veto that plan if he or she thinks that's the best for the country. But he or she acts in concert with the Council of Presidential Advisors. So while the president has discretionary powers to decide whether to veto such plans, he or she will have to work with them. Okay, so the first custodial role has to do with the reserves. The second has to do with appointments to key positions in the public service, in the legal service, and, would you believe it, also within SAF. The top chiefs, he or she can veto these appointments. There are 3 more powers. The first is the ability to authorize investigations by the director of the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau should the Prime Minister deny the director the go-ahead. The second is the ability to vary or veto restraining orders under the Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act. If, the cabinet has a different view from the Council of Religious Harmony that is within the president's office. The final one is that the president has to give his or her concurrence if the government wishes to continue detaining someone under the Internal Security Act if the ISA Advisory Council says to release them. So to recap, there are 5 key custodial powers that the president has, and these are veto powers or power to vary, decisions for 5 things. First, on reserves. Second, on key appointments in the public sector, the legal sector, and also SAF. Third, on investigations by the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau. Fourth, on detentions under the Internal Security Act. And fifth, on restraining orders to do with religious harmony.
Got it. Wow, that actually spells it out so clearly for me. When it comes to, for example, other leadership positions like the Prime Minister role, we don't really vote for that role, right? We vote for the members of parliament, and then the Prime Minister gets selected from that pool. So why is it that for the role of the president, we vote specifically for the role?
Yeah. Well, it is a unique thing, and you are absolutely right, because we get to vote for 2 things as citizens, right? First, we get to vote for our, you could say, our local representative, member of parliament in a parliamentary election. You're voting for a party to represent you based on the candidates that they give you. And that vote then comes through, and it establishes which is the governing party of Singapore within the legislature, which is Parliament. And Parliament then makes rules, creates legislature, comments, and shapes policies. But from Parliament, we then draw, or the governing party draws on some key members of parliament to become members of cabinet. And they are the ones who are actually proposing legislation and proposing policy. And from among them, or what you say, from among the first of equals, comes the Prime Minister. So you'll see the Prime Minister and the cabinet, which is 14, 15, 16 people. They are the primary executives. They have the decision-making powers within the country. But when they want to do something, they present it to Parliament. Okay, so then Parliament looks at that legislation, and then they say, and then they take the decision to go with it. Then basically they seek the President's assent, and the President provides the signature on that legislation. Now, we also vote for the President. Day in, day out, the President acts on the advice of Cabinet. Why? Because remember, Cabinet's already duly elected, right? But we elect the President because of those 5 key custodial roles, the primary one being the ability to block a duly elected government's plans to spend the country's past reserves. So that is indeed what you would call a direct election. But it ain't so simple, Joel, because in the first part of that process of becoming a candidate, while it's direct, we actually say, we want some QC leh. So we have to, it's stipulated in the Constitution that, of course, this person must be of good character. But this person also has to be found eligible by something called the Presidential Elections Committee. And there are rules to establish eligibility. There is one set of rules for candidates who come through the public sector. And so they are really very high level. You can be a former cabinet minister, a former speaker of the House, members of the top brass of the public service. And so that's that one automatic track. And today, as we know, there is somebody like Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam. He would qualify automatically because he was a former cabinet minister, right? Then there is the automatic track for the private sector. Okay, so these are really top brass in, CEOs, and it's written that way. So you must prove that you were in an executive decision-making role in a company that has shareholder equity of no less than 500 million over 3 years. And, the track record has to be that it was profitable over that period of time. So that qualifying role seems a high bar, but it is deemed to be necessary because you want that financial competence and somebody who can project forward for the country, right? Not just for a company, for the country, whether, the expenditure of reserves is going to not just address a certain immediate need, but what are the long-term implications of that decision? Finally, Joe, so we described the automatic tracks. There's a deliberative track where if there are stipulations there, but if basically, a candidate puts forward his credentials that are akin to the automatic track, then, the PEC, the Presidential Elections Committee, can decide whether that experience is akin to what's been stipulated on the automatic track. This is where you see Mr. Ng Kok Song saying that he will apply to be a candidate on the deliberative track for the public sector because he was the Global Chief Investment Officer at GIC, which is actually one of the qualifying officers, right? Officers, as in role.
Yeah.
And this is where you see Mr. George Goh, because he says that he will also put forward his track record on the private sector deliberative track, right? And Mr. Tan Kin Lian, I think it remains to be seen, but he has said that having been past CEO of NTUC Income, he would also try and put himself forward on the automatic track because he thinks that even then, when he was CEO, NTUC Income was already an enterprise of 500 million shareholder equity.
So when it comes to the deliberative tracks, do we know what is the process in which they deliberate, whether or not someone can qualify?
Well, certainly you see all those binders that Mr.
Yeah.
Koh presented at ELD. Basically, the candidates themselves have to present what their track record is, tell the PEC which track, whether automatic or deliberative, whether public sector or private sector they're applying for. And then they have to actually say why, if they're coming on the deliberative track, the PEC should find that that experience is akin to what is already very clearly set out on the automatic track. What the deliberative track does allow for is an aggregation of time. So like in the private sector one, how can you add it up so that it comes up to the 3 years, because people may have been in different organizations and that is allowed for. Same with the public sector one. But there is no clear stipulation of an aggregation of the value of the companies that you may have been or are currently in charge of and running. So that's why, in a way, there is that flexibility, Joel. There's the automatic track, but the deliberative one, and therefore it does matter that there are human beings reading files and trying to grasp, and make sense of what the candidates are saying about themselves.
Understand. That makes it so clear. So now that we know that there are the different tracks into which you can try to get nominated, with that comes the conversation of the establishment choice, right? So from what we see, Mr. Tharman is the one this year. But what is this whole establishment's choice all about?
Right. Well, I guess when you talk about the establishment, you think of it as being people who are part of government or close to government to some extent, right? So you could almost say that, certainly Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam was part of government. And having been a minister, he was certainly part of the governing party. So there's no running away from that. And he qualifies automatically. So please remember that the system allows for that. It's not illegitimate. It is not discounted. It's not set aside that if you were part of government, part of the governing party, you can't run. You can. Okay? But certainly there are those who say, okay, in the case of Mr. Ng Kok Song, he was part of GIC, which is very close to government. It is not part of government. Its key shareholder would be, the government of Singapore, right? So therefore, in a way, you would say that he is an establishment candidate because he's very close to government, though not exactly within government. Then you have Mr. George Goh, who, as we understand, is now trying to put forward his candidacy as having been continuing to be the boss of several companies, right? So he says that he was not part of government. He's not close to government, as in he wasn't like GIC. His company is not like GIC. But guess what? He also, when he came out, he said that he was an ambassador, represented Singapore in Morocco. So you could say that he's not part of government, but he was close to government and really, really, in a way, represented Singapore overseas. So people will say that he is part of the establishment. Right? Yeah. So I think it's really, therefore, useful to have this conversation for us to sort these things out, to figure out in our minds who's really part of what is the establishment. That means maybe government, maybe close to government, maybe working within government paradigm, or projecting Singapore's interests overseas, and somebody who has nothing to do with any of that at all.
But it seems like, with this particular election,
Yes.
How people are perceiving it to be would be that, even the media has said Mr. Ng Kok Song is kind of like the middle ground candidate, and then you have Mr. Tharman as the establishment candidate, and then Mr. George Goh as the independent.
So we use these terms too loosely, right? I've just spelt out that Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam is definitely part of government, part of governing party, so very, really front and center, part of government.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that Mr. Ng is not part of the establishment, because he's putting forward his candidacy as having been really almost head honcho of
Yeah.
GIC.
Yeah.
So GIC is not government per se, but is close to government and serves government. So you can't say he's not part of the establishment.
Right.
Then when Mr. George Goh comes up, the first thing he says is he was ambassador of Morocco. So not part of government, but close to government and doing very important state work,
Right.
representing the country. It's good.
Yeah.
It's a good thing.
Yeah.
It's a good experience. It's because the president does have to represent Singapore
For sure.
to
Yeah.
foreign powers and foreign, friends, right? Countries.
Yeah.
So he is certainly part of the establishment, but he's just not part of government per se, not part of the governing party.
Got it.
Finally, Mr. Tan Kin Lian, if he puts it in, right, he was part of NTUC. Now, you could argue that NTUC is definitely many arms further removed from government because it's part of NTUC. Politically, there's a symbiotic relationship between the PAP and the NTUC, but NTUC is not part of government, doesn't ostensibly, do what government needs. It's not like GIC, and it's certainly, he's not out there to fly the Singapore flag as a job, as an ambassador. So you would say that Tan Kin Lian is the furthest away from the establishment
Understood.
and not part of the establishment.
Got it. Could you also maybe explain the first past the post voting system, electoral system, and why maybe Singapore actually adopts this electoral system?
We've always had this. It's part of our British colonial heritage, and the system is such that, as long as you have one man more than the next candidate, you win. Of course, if there are two candidates only, you get one person more than 50%, you win. But if you have five candidates, whoever has the one vote more than the fourth person wins. But in the actual election system, if your margin is within 2% of each other, top and second candidate, you can actually ask for a recount just to make sure. And then because we have overseas voters, and this is the reason why it's important, not to just to register that you are voting overseas, but that you are going to vote for this election, then ELD has the numbers and it will see if the numbers are going to make a difference, when you add it all together. And therefore, if the margin is so tight that that number of overseas voters, whether they actually vote, whether we actually receive their ballots in the mail, comes in, and it can make the difference, you actually have to wait till those come in. Yeah. So first past the post system is historical. It's quite important. It just simply means if you have one more man than the next, then as the top candidate, you make it.
Got it. We'll return to the conversation in just a few moments, but first, here's a gentle reminder for you to click that thumbs up button and also that subscribe button to show us some love. And now, back to the conversation. So maybe I want to talk about the election process because for many of us listening to this podcast, it will be our first time voting. So we don't really know what to expect. But the closest thing is probably the GE experience that we've all been through. So maybe could you just walk us through what the process is like from the rate of elections being announced to nomination and things to look out for if there's going to be like a cooling day similar to the general election?
Yeah. It's pretty similar. So basically, the Prime Minister issues the writ of election, which just says that, okay, the whole process of election begins now. He must give at least 10 days before nomination day is called. So he's going to have to say, this is the date when, nomination happens, and candidates have to submit a few papers. They certainly have to bring their certificate of eligibility, which they must have applied for no more than 5 days after the writ is issued. Because remember, there's quite a lot of homework to do. The Presidential Elections Committee has to look through the dossier and decide and then issue this certificate. So on nomination day, the candidates have to bring that certificate of eligibility. They also have to bring a certificate from the community committee. And this establishes whether a candidate says they are race X, the committee has to certify that that candidate is of race X. And why does this matter? As we saw in the 2017 election, the rules have now provided for an election to be reserved for a certain candidate of a certain ethnicity if that ethnic group has not been represented over 5 terms through a duly elected president. Yeah. So now it is quite important that the process is put through this community committee. And so on nomination day, the candidate also has to bring a certificate that certifies him or her as a certain race.
Got it. So can we maybe revisit some of the past elections? Because, a lot has happened.
My memory, but go ahead.
All right, so I want to talk about the 2011 one first. So that was, my friends call it the Battle of the Tans, right? So
4 of them.
4 Tans competing, and Mr. Tony Tan won in the election. What were some of the key takeaways for you for that presidential election, or some of the things that you can remember from it?
Well, it was actually a year of elections. So in May in 2011, we had a very highly contested general or parliamentary elections where actually you saw the opposition party, Workers' Party, make a breakthrough, right, in Aljunied. So I think that the general mood, of the voting public was sort of very high towards sort of, let's go with it. Let's see what different people can offer us, whether it's, as MP or certainly because the year coincided with presidential election, what the presidential election candidates can offer. I think, so that's already the setting, right? Very exciting, very pumped up in terms of, wanting to exercise your vote and trying to see what people can offer. Then on the other side, you will see that one of the candidates was Mr. Tan Jise, and he had actually contested in the parliamentary election, so there was a spillover, remember? And, so in a way, my second point is that there was that spillover in terms of content on the part of candidates, as to what they wanted to offer. And we recap. We know that the role of the president is day-to-day, in the main, to act on the advice of cabinet. The president does not have policy-setting powers. It's merely a veto power. So while he or she is within the orbit of the executive, he or she does not actually have the power to create public policy. But the second point is really that we saw some candidates actually putting forward a kind of discourse about how they would set policy, they would do this or that, if they were elected as president, which I think was a bit out of bounds. In the end, the difference between Dr. Tony Tan and Dr. Tan Cheng Bock was actually quite close. So I remember commenting on TV, and we had to wait because, as I mentioned just now, if the difference is within 2% of the voting, public, ELD actually allows candidates to request for a recount. So I know that the top 2 candidates, certainly Dr. Tan Cheng Bock, went back and forth from his stomping ground back to ELD to check and back and forth. So it was a very long night for that reason. And we only realized it when we saw the result. And the margin, the winning margin was, just slightly above 7,700, something like that. Yeah. So it's very, very close. Yeah.
Wow.
Oh, okay. Since your media, the memes,
right,
the videos and everything from that era, fantastic. I think they made the contest very accessible, and the songs. Yeah, there's a lot of creativity around, not just, I believe, formal election advertising, but that ordinary citizens, netizens, are just putting their creative best into making the election very exciting. But of course, you want to draw the boundaries around what the candidates say that they can offer, and they shouldn't offer beyond what the role actually is.
Understood. Nice. And since this is going to be the first time we're going to be voting since that election.
We don't know because it's still up to nomination
that
day.
is very true.
Yeah,
Okay.
but let's see. I
Yeah.
think there are so many people who've put, so many, it's all relative, but we have at least 4 individuals who said that they would like to put themselves forward. And on nomination day, we'll see, who's duly qualified and therefore actually comes through on nomination day to be a bona fide candidate. But go ahead, Joel.
Yes. So in terms of what to expect, right? Like, do you think it will be something similar as to what happened in 2011? Because, back then there were 4 candidates. Now we're talking about 4 as well. Do you think it will be a similar kind of election?
I think first point is it's a good thing that there's choice. I think people do want to be able to have choice. Second, that we have candidates of diverse backgrounds, all kind of quite close to establishment, it doesn't matter. But we also have Mr. Tan Gillian with the NTUC background. But they are of different characters and nature, so let's hear what they can offer, I think. So first thing is that there's choice. But second is, if there's choice, then we have to think, what are we choosing them for? And I think the onus is on us, even as we have the right to vote, we also have the responsibility to figure out what it is we're voting for. And I think something like this is useful, having this conversation about, the role of the president, and then sort of wonder, well, who would be the most suitable? Who do we see as someone who is above, or rather able to stand above the political fray? The political fray as in the partisanship, of political parties. Because we still have an election, it's political, but partisanship, standing above that, can be somebody whom we feel we can identify with, somebody who can identify with us, the diversity that Singapore is, and somebody who can really, represent us with pride, who's our superb diplomat. But also, that our foreign friends feel is interesting to engage with. Because even as I said, the president acts on the advice of cabinet, the president does have informal consultations with the prime minister. And so whatever interesting nuggets he or she can gather, in this case, all he's, right? Gentlemen, whatever they can gather or he can gather can be useful in his private consultations with the Prime Minister. These are consultations that are completely off the record. It allows the President to advise or warn or share useful information with the Prime Minister and therefore with Cabinet. So I think those are the things that will be interesting. So 1, choice is good. 2, we have the right to make a choice, but we then have the responsibility to figure out what are we choosing for.
Yeah. All right. And then now let's go to the 2017 presidential election where President Halimah became the president. So there were many people who were upset or unhappy about the reserved presidency that happened that year. And you briefly talked about it earlier as well. So maybe you could just quickly recap for us, like what exactly went down in that year.
Well, I think as we mentioned earlier, there was a reserved election. It was reserved for Malay candidates only. Actually, Dr. Tan Cheng Bock, who had contested in 2011, tried to challenge the idea that the election held in 2017 would be an election for the 5th president. And if it's the 5th president with no, Malay candidates or no Malay president that had emerged, right, then the 2017 election be reserved for a Malay person. So that challenge was not successful because Wee Kim Wee was deemed to be the first elected president, not elected by vote, but was endued with the power of an elected president. So if you count it, then the 2017 one was there had been 5 presidents without a Malay president, and therefore it was saved for Malay candidates only. Then as we went through that process of getting the certificate of eligibility, remember we discussed it just now, only one candidate received that, because the other candidates were private sector candidates whose companies did not meet the criteria of being of at least $500 million in shareholder equity. It was under that. So while they put it in, the PEC felt that the very clear rules and criteria had not been met, and so it was very hard to give them the COE, different kind of COE. So in the end, there was only one candidate, and there was therefore on nomination day, if there's only one candidate, then it is in a way a walkover. And Madam Halima is deemed to be duly elected. It's not any, there's no discount on her authority, or, there's no kind of shaving off of the legitimacy. It's a proper system. There was only one candidate, and therefore she's duly elected president. I think people are in two minds. They recognize that the president has to represent all of who we are as a multiracial country. So there should be some way in which to ensure that that is the case. And we have a diverse slate of presidents over our history, right? Now that there's an election because of the custodial powers. But on the other hand, there are others who will say, but this cuts into the meritocracy and the kind of electoral powers, of people getting to vote. And so it was somewhat controversial. It's been 6 years. I think, most people would feel that our current president has done a sterling job, especially during this crisis of a generation with the pandemic. And we know that she is absolutely the right person for the office, right? But the question is the system. Does the need for ethnic representation justify the reservation? My point of view, it's a hiatus-triggered provision. The next time we ever see this is when you have a lack of a president of a certain ethnic background for 30 years. And so we need to work very hard to ensure that all opportunities are given for people to reach leadership positions in the public service, also the private sector, so that we never ever need to use this provision ever again. But it's a backstop for the day when we did not achieve that. And it's really 5 terms, 5 times 6 years, So it's up to us to make this history.
Got it. All right. So I just want to end off this podcast with a few questions about tips for first-time voters.
Oh, goodness.
Right?
I'll try.
So when we're thinking about, okay, who should we vote for? What would some of the key considerations be? When we just filter it down to what are some key things that we need to think about?
Okay, first, whether the candidate himself knows what the role is. And we've discussed this, right? So don't let anyone oversell you the role. I can do this, I can do that, when actually, no. But if the person can tell you, I can do this and this for these reasons, and it is actually accurate, then that's a person who has that political literacy, and will really be very respectful of what the Constitution says. It's a different battle. If you don't like what the Constitution says, it's a different battle, and that's within Parliament, and that's a battle you fight within parliamentary elections. Okay, so first point is look for a candidate who has enough political literacy to campaign around the office that exists. Not the office that does not exist. Secondly, look at their background and see what it says as a track record, personality. Do they have the character? What's the timbre of the man? To be able to then do the 3 roles that the president has, not just the custodial ones, but certainly the ceremonial ones and the community one. Is this person somebody who can inspire people to go the extra mile for community? Is this person someone that you can envisage, representing Singapore in an international forum? Because, he has to do you proud.
Yeah, true.
Yeah,
Fair.
yeah. And I guess the third one is really, to consider whether your thoughts about race, language, religion, special interests of that candidate matches yours. Sometimes there is that, kind of alignment, right? Then you go, this person, I can really jive with this person. So, yeah. I think those are the things which at the bottom line means, to kind of really understand what the role is and don't do last minute homework. Very hard. Because each of them every day will put out 3 things they want to say, and it's very, very hard to kind of absorb all of it, especially if you have more than 2 candidates.
My final question for us today, earlier on you mentioned about not leaving homework to the last. So apart from listening to every episode of this podcast for homework, what else can people do to keep themselves informed?
Well, I think the elections department website has actually a very, very interesting, useful document. It's called the explanatory document on presidential elections according to the Constitution of Singapore. It's a very long title. It's only in English. So if you go to the elections department website, then you go to a tab on elections, you scroll down to presidential elections, you'll see there, you tap that, then there's a whole document, A to Z in a very kind of too long, don't read version of it. And then somewhere at the top, there is, a little tab which you can, go to this document. I wish they made it more accessible, to be honest. But that is so useful because it gives you in 3 pages, 4 pages, exactly what the role is. And it gives you examples, what the president can do and what the president can't do. So if at least you've got those rules, you know what you're voting for. But if it comes to candidates, it's very, very hard to kind of, apart from listening to your podcasts and maybe some snippets that you find mainstream media online or whatever, it'll not be easy to get to know the candidates, certainly if there are more than 2. Yeah. I think Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam has the advantage because he has been a minister since 2001. And he's actually a very, very well-loved politician. So many people have said, why can't he be our prime minister? But anyway, let me not
open that can of worms.
Okay. But, so he's a household name. Yeah, if you want to put it there. Of course, Harvey Norman is a household name. So zooming out, who runs Harvey Norman? And that's why, in a way, George Koh may also have far more signature than the rest. Tan Kin Lian was a former candidate, so people may remember him from then. And he does occasionally comment on fiscal issues and financial issues. So I think Mr. Ng Kok Song, is a newcomer to the space. And I guess if people have some notion of what GIC is, then that may be useful. But as a norm, people who work in GIC, even the top knobs, right, are probably less well known because their thing is not to kind of be out there as a personality. You know? Their thing is whether they are doing that job for Singapore to kind of grow, our reserves.
Got it. Thank you so much, Dr. Gillian. Wow, I feel like this episode has really just enlightened me.
You're too kind. But it's been interesting to kind of have the conversation.
For sure. I really, really appreciate you taking your time to speak with us. I think a lot of people out there are really grateful as well. I'll thank you on their behalf.
Vote wisely, always. I think this is something we treasure, that we have the opportunity to vote. Voting is compulsory, but, that is actually quite a good system, I think, than leaving it to whether people have time or whether they are stuck in industry and, bosses don't let them off or whatever. So voting is compulsory. Choose wisely.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much, Dr. Gillian.
Thanks, Joel.
All right, guys, you've made it. What a conversation to start this series with. Now, this episode was brought to you by the people over at Zodapop by Zero Media, which specializes in the production and distribution of podcasts and not forgetting community building among podcasters here in Singapore. The Zodapop team really gave their all for this episode, and it would really mean the world to us if you could give us a thumbs up and also hit that subscribe button. This show is made entirely free for everyone to consume, and all we're asking for is for you to share this with your friends and family members. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you on the next episode of Political Prude, the podcast. This was the Zodapop podcast.